Chapter 1. The Unexpected Visitor. It was the first morning of the new year, 1897. A heavy fog had settled over London, muffling the usual clatter of carts and hoofbeats that echoed along Baker Street. The streets outside were still damp from a light overnight rain, and a faint smell of smoke and spent fireworks lingered in the air, a ghostly memory of the city's revels. Inside the sitting room of 221B, I sat comfortably by the fire, nursing a cup of strong Assam tea and reading the day's Times. Sherlock Holmes had been uncommonly quiet over the Christmas season, contenting himself with chemical experiments and monographs on obscure tobacco ash. I had even dared to hope, foolishly perhaps, that we might enjoy a peaceful turn of the year. That illusion was shattered precisely at 10:15. The door flew open with a gust of cold air and a flurry of fog as Holmes entered in his Inverness cape, boots still glistening from the wet pavement. His lean frame looked almost spectral in the dim morning light, and his grey eyes were alight with that peculiar intensity which I had come to associate with the scent of a fresh mystery. "Well, Watson," he said briskly, stripping off his gloves and tossing them onto the table, "the new year has wasted no time in presenting its first corpse." "A murder?" I asked, instinctively putting down my cup. "Possibly. Certainly a death of interest. And if the man who came to me not 10 minutes ago is to be believed, something more sinister than the usual holiday accident is afoot." As if summoned by these words, a knock sounded on the door. Mrs. Hudson appeared a moment later, ushering in a rather dishevelled figure, a small man in formal evening dress, his hair disordered and his cravat stained darkly at the collar. He looked to be in his late 30s, with a lawyer's precise manner, but a trembling hand that betrayed deep agitation. "Mr. Reginald Thorne," Holmes announced with a nod. "He believes he witnessed a murder just after midnight." Thorne sank into the chair opposite me. His eyes darted about the room, but Holmes's calm demeanour seemed to steady him somewhat. "Mr. Holmes," he began, voice hoarse with fatigue and emotion, "I beg your pardon for arriving unannounced. I did not know where else to turn. The police, they think it was suicide. But it wasn't. It couldn't have been." "Start at the beginning, Mr. Thorne," Holmes said, seating himself on the edge of the chaise longue and folding his hands together. "Tell us everything, in order. Spare no detail, however minor it may seem." Thorne nodded, swallowing hard. "The event was a New Year's Eve supper at the residence of Sir Evelyn Fairburn, number 12, Grosvenor Square. A rather exclusive affair. 15 guests in all, including myself. Sir Evelyn was a man of wealth and some eccentric habits. He took pleasure in the theatrical, especially during these seasonal gatherings. This year, he insisted we raise a toast to the new year in complete darkness. To purge the past and drink blindly into the future, he said. Thorne paused to collect himself. Holmes remained silent, watching him with hawk-like attention. At the stroke of midnight, the gas lights were extinguished. We stood in silence for a moment, the butler having earlier prepared champagne flutes for everyone at the table. When the toast was complete, the lights were brought up again, and Sir Evelyn was slumped in his chair quite still, his head tilted unnaturally. Blood, a trickle of it, ran from his left ear. "A physician was present?" Holmes asked. "One of the guests, yes, a doctor, Charles Ludgate. He examined the body and pronounced him dead. The police were called at once. There were murmurs of heart failure, but Dr. Ludgate suspected poison. The glass at Sir Evelyn's place was untouched, save for a faint lip mark." "A curious contradiction," Holmes murmured. "Please continue." "Later," Thorne said, voice growing quieter, "a note was discovered among Sir Evelyn's personal effects, written in his own hand, It hinted at despair, even spoke of final release. The police took it as confirmation of suicide. "But you do not share their view." Thorne leaned forward, his hands clenched. "Because I saw something, just a flicker during the darkness. A silhouette beside Sir Evelyn. Someone moved quickly and silently. I saw a gloved hand reach across the table. I cannot say what was done or by whom, but there was movement, of that I am certain. It was no accident, and Sir Evelyn did not take his own life." "Did you speak of this to the authorities?" "I did," he said, with visible discomfort, "but they dismissed it as nerves and confusion, said I must have imagined it in the commotion, but I know what I saw." Holmes rose and paced briefly by the window, then turned sharply. "Sir Evelyn was a bachelor, I believe?" "Yes, widowed 10 years, no children. His estate is considerable and complicated. I handled some of his financial affairs, in fact. There are no clear heirs." "All the better," Holmes said softly. "Then a murder would not only be possible, but profitable." "Precisely." Holmes nodded once, decisively. "Watson, fetch your coat. We are expected in Grosvenor Square. Let us hope the room has not yet gone cold." "But what do you suspect, Holmes?" I asked, rising. "I suspect, Watson," he replied, "that this year has begun precisely as the last one ended, in blood." And with that we stepped out into the fog. Chapter 2. The Scene at Grosvenor Square. The fog had thickened as we made our way by hansom cab to Grosvenor Square. It moved in slow, ghostly coils between the lamplight, cloaking the grand facades of Mayfair in a pall of silent mystery. Holmes sat bolt upright beside me, his eyes half closed, but his mind, I knew, alert and racing ahead. He had lit his pipe shortly after we set off, and spoke not a word until the cab rattled to a halt outside number 12. The townhouse stood imposing and stately, 3 stories of fine Georgian brick with tall, narrow windows shuttered against the morning gloom. A constable stood guard outside the door, stamping his boots against the cold and eyeing us with suspicion until Holmes flashed his card and introduced himself in his clipped, authoritative tone. "Inspector Gregson is inside," the constable offered as we entered. "Bit of a tangle, this one." Holmes made a non-committal noise and stepped into the entrance hall. Inside, the warmth of gas lamps lit the polished wood and velvet drapery with a golden glow. But even the finery could not mask the stillness. A strange quiet clung to the house, as though time itself had paused in the wake of death. A pair of footmen loitered by the staircase, pale and subdued. Somewhere in the upper rooms we could hear the low murmur of conversation. A sharp voice called from the drawing room. "Holmes!" Inspector Tobias Gregson emerged, dressed impeccably, in a dark frock coat, moustache bristling with indignation. He offered Holmes a curt nod and ignored me entirely, as was his habit. "I suppose you've come sniffing about to prove the Yard wrong?" "I suppose I have," Holmes said, his tone dry but not unkind. "Let us not delay each other, Gregson." "I believe the body is in the dining room." "Was," Gregson corrected. "The undertaker's men took him an hour ago, not much left to see." "Then I shall make do with what remains," Holmes replied. "Lead the way." We followed Gregson through a pair of wide oak doors into a grand dining room. The tables stretched nearly the full length of the room, polished mahogany adorned now only with empty glasses, tarnished silver, and the pale remains of wax drippings from extinguished candles. A heavy scent of cologne, cigar smoke, and something faintly metallic still lingered in the air. Holmes moved like a bloodhound off the leash, circling the table once, then twice, pausing to inspect minute details. An overturned chair, a wine ring on a sideboard, a napkin carelessly dropped. He leaned low over Sir Evelyn's chair, running one gloved finger along the carved backrest and murmuring softly to himself. "This was his seat?" he asked, without looking up. Gregson nodded. "At the head of the table, naturally." Holmes examined the floor beneath, then straightened suddenly and moved to the wall sconce nearest the chair. "Gaslighting was extinguished manually?" he asked. "Aye. The butler turned it off at the main valve outside, then relit them 5 minutes later. No electric lights?" "None in this room," Gregson said. Sir Evelyn disapproved of the practice. Holmes gave a soft grunt of approval. "And the glass?" he asked, pointing to a tray near the sideboard where several champagne flutes had been arranged. "Those are the ones used last night," Gregson said. "We've taken the liberty of labelling them. This one," he pointed to the furthest on the right, "belonged to Sir Evelyn. There are faint traces of cyanide, almost tasteless in champagne, I'm told." Holmes picked up the flute with a handkerchief, peered at the rim, and sniffed the inside. "No lipstick? No fingerprints? Cleanly handled. The poison was added after the glasses were poured then." Gregson's brow furrowed. "You can tell that just by looking." "Not with certainty, no," Holmes said, "but the killer had only a brief window in which to act. If Sir Evelyn had prepared the glass himself, the poison would have been already mixed in the bottle, and yet no other guest was affected." "Curious." He turned to the far end of the table. "Who sat opposite him?" "Miss Lydia Ashcroft, cousin to the deceased." "And to his immediate right and left?" "Colonel Bainbridge and a Mr. Daniel Hawthorne, an old friend of the family." Holmes nodded. "And you've questioned them?" "Briefly. They all swear they saw nothing, heard nothing. Lights went out, toast was made, and when they came up again, he was dead." Holmes tapped a finger to his lips. "Any other deaths in the house last night? Dogs, cats, parakeets?" Gregson looked annoyed. "Of course not." "Then the poison was either in his specific glass or applied locally." He turned and strode to the butler, a gaunt man who stood nervously by the door. "You prepared the drinks?" "Yes, sir," the man replied. "At Sir Evelyn's instructions, I poured 1 glass for each guest from 2 bottles of Veuve Clicquot. I served them all at once, just before midnight." "And the bottles?" "Still in the ice bucket, sir. I've not touched them since." Holmes examined the bottles, sniffed them, and motioned for a label. "Watson," he said, "make a note of this vintage." "We may want it tested," I obliged, scribbling in my notebook. Holmes paced a little more, then stopped suddenly, eyes fixed on the fireplace. "Ah," he said, "now that is interesting." "What?" I asked. "Someone has burned something here this morning. See the fresh ash, the faint scent of ink? Possibly a letter, something torn hastily and fed to the fire before it could be examined. A guilty hand, perhaps?" Gregson stepped forward. "Could have been anyone." Holmes smiled faintly. "Indeed. But not everyone had opportunity." At that moment the door opened, and a tall, pale woman in morning dress entered. Her face was composed, but there was a tremor in her step. Gregson introduced her. "Miss Lydia Ashcroft, Sir Evelyn's cousin." Holmes bowed. "Miss Ashcroft, my condolences. Might I ask, had your cousin been in low spirits recently?" She hesitated. "He was troubled, but not despairing. He loved drama. He often spoke in riddles and morbid phrases, but he would never take his own life." Holmes studied her face with that unreadable gaze of his. Then he said quietly, "Thank you. That will be all for now." As she left the room, Holmes turned to me. "Well, Watson," he murmured, "we have a body, a room full of suspects, a timed blackout, and a single poisoned glass. All that remains is to find the invisible hand behind it all." And with that, he turned once more to the table, his eyes alight with the thrill of the chase. Chapter 3. A host of suspects. The drawing room at number 12 Grosvenor Square had been repurposed into an informal parlour of inquiry. Inspector Gregson had gathered the remaining guests, and they now sat in tense silence on the velvet-upholstered chairs and chaises, as if still haunted by the spectre of their host's sudden demise. The new year had barely drawn breath, yet its shadow was long. Sherlock Holmes stood near the mantelpiece, one hand resting on the carved marble, the other holding a small notebook that, to my surprise, he never once opened. He needed no aide-memoire, for his mind had already sketched each guest's place at the table, each spoken word, each glance exchanged the night before. I sat slightly to one side, observing not Holmes but the suspects, though none, as yet, had been formally accused. "Ladies and gentlemen," Holmes began calmly, "thank you for your patience. I am here not to intrude upon your grief, but to understand the truth of what happened in this house last night. Sir Evelyn Fairbairn's death may have appeared sudden, even theatrical, but the facts suggest something more deliberate." Several heads turned, some startled, others stoic. "To that end," Holmes continued, "I should like to speak to each of you briefly. Let us begin with Colonel Bainbridge." The colonel, a broad-shouldered man with a face weathered by decades of sun and service, cleared his throat and approached with military formality. He stood straight as a rifle, his grey moustache bristling with restrained indignation. "You sat to Sir Evelyn's right," Holmes began. "Indeed, we toasted together. I heard nothing untoward in the dark, just the clink of glass and a few awkward chuckles. When the lights returned, the poor devil was slumped forward. I assumed it was a fainting spell." "Did you notice anything strange about his behaviour earlier in the evening?" "Strange?" Bainbridge frowned. "Fairbairn was always eccentric, prone to quoting Roman poets and toasting fate, but no more than usual." Holmes inclined his head. "Thank you. And now, Mr. Hawthorne, if you please." Daniel Hawthorne, a tall man with thinning hair and a keen, scholarly air, rose stiffly and walked forward. His eyes, unlike Bainbridge's, betrayed a certain anxiety. Nervous hands fidgeted with a gold watch chain at his waistcoat. "You were to Sir Evelyn's left," Holmes said. "Yes. We were old university friends. He was in good spirits, I thought. Talked of starting the year with a revised will, some new philosophy of rebirth, though I confess I found him more theatrical than usual." "Did he say whom he intended to name as heir?" Hawthorne shook his head. He was evasive. He said something like, "Let the future drink to the past." Typical of him. Holmes nodded. "And did you notice any movement during the blackout?" "A great deal of awkward shifting, certainly," Hawthorne replied, "but nothing I can identify with certainty. The whole room was a whisper of fabric and shuffling feet." "Very good. Thank you." As Hawthorne stepped away, Holmes turned to the young woman seated alone near the window. Her dark dress was tasteful, her face composed, but her eyes were red-rimmed. This was Miss Lydia Ashcroft, cousin to the deceased. "Miss Ashcroft," Holmes said gently. "You sat opposite your cousin, yes?" "I did." Her voice was soft, clipped with grief. "And you last saw him alive just before the lights went out?" She nodded. "He was laughing," she said. "He always laughed at his own drama. When the butler extinguished the lights, I raised my glass, and then nothing. The room was pitch black. When they were lit again," she looked away. Holmes studied her with more intensity than usual. "Did your cousin ever mention any enemies, any recent disputes?" She hesitated, then said, "There was some talk of a falling out with his business partner, Mr. Athelney, but that was months ago. Sir Evelyn rarely held grudges for long." "Mr. Athelney is not among the guests?" "No, he declined the invitation." Holmes's eyes narrowed, just slightly. "Did you notice anything unusual last night? Any object,
scent or sound that seemed out of place? A long pause. I thought I heard a click, like a watch case snapping shut. But it was faint and might have been my imagination. Holmes gave a small, thoughtful nod. "Thank you, Miss Ashcroft."
He turned then to Gregson. "Inspector, have you the guest list?" Gregson handed it over. Holmes ran a finger down the names, lips moving silently. Then he turned to the remaining guests, 4 in number, a Reverend Chalmers and his wife, a young barrister named Alan Bristow, and an actress of some fame, Miss Viola d'Angers. Each was called forward in turn, and Holmes questioned them with quiet precision. None admitted to seeing anything, though the Reverend's wife remarked that the champagne had tasted bitter. Holmes's eyes flicked to her sharply, but he said nothing at the time. As the final guest returned to their seat, Holmes paced the room slowly. "We now know this," he said, tapping his fingertips together. "Only one glass was poisoned. That glass belonged to Sir Evelyn. The poison was likely added during the blackout. No one heard a scream or cry suggesting a swift, silent death." He paused, facing the room. "But the most telling detail is what was missing, not what was seen. Sir Evelyn's customary diamond cufflinks were not on his person when he was found. Why remove them? Why risk exposure for such a trifle?" "Robbery?" Gregson offered. Holmes shook his head. "Too personal, too selective. The killer knew him, and perhaps knew what those cufflinks meant." He turned to Lydia. "Did your cousin speak of those cufflinks recently?" She blinked, startled. "Only that he had them engraved for the new year. He said they marked a turning point in his affairs." Holmes gave the faintest smile. "Indeed. And now we must ask, who among you knew of that turning point and feared it?" He let the question hang, then turned to Gregson. "We shall need to search the rooms of every guest, quietly. I would wager a misplaced cufflink may yet find its way into the light." "Do you suspect one of them, then?" I whispered, as the guests murmured behind us. Holmes didn't reply at first. His eyes were scanning the carpet as though reading an invisible script. "I suspect many things," he said finally. "But certainty requires one more piece." And with that, he strode from the room, his coat swirling behind him like the fog outside. Chapter 4. A shadow in the fog. Later that afternoon, the fog still clung thick to the streets of Mayfair, settling into crevices and curling around chimneys like a silent watchman. The gas lamps flickered dimly through the mist, and even the most familiar of thoroughfares took on a spectral air. It was in this grim setting that Holmes and I emerged once more from number 12 Grosvenor Square, cloaked and gloved against the chill. "Where are we going, Holmes?" I asked, tightening my scarf. "I'd assumed you meant to search the guest rooms." He gave me a sidelong glance, his step brisk and determined. "In time, Watson, but for now we pursue a shadow, one that left no invitation, made no toast, and yet was present all the same." I frowned. "You mean someone from outside the guest list?" "Precisely. There is an invisible party to this crime, someone not seated at the table, yet close enough to poison a glass with no one the wiser." "And you believe this person entered during the blackout?" "Or shortly before? We must explore every possibility." He paused at the end of the street and hailed a cab. "To Clerkenwell. There is a name Miss Ashcroft mentioned that bears further interest. Mr. Athelney, the estranged business partner. I should like a word with him." As the cab lurched forward through the muffled streets, Holmes resumed his pipe, tapping it rhythmically against his coat. I could sense his mind was busy, even restless, yet outwardly calm as ever. "Consider the circumstances," he said suddenly, "in which a man changes his will, invites select witnesses, makes a dramatic speech, and is dead before the ink is dry. It is not merely murder, it is a performance, and performances demand an audience. But the motive, surely that must be inheritance." Holmes's eyes sparkled. So it appears. And yet appearances, dear Watson, are the very bait of illusion. Remember, a man with enemies rarely drinks alone. We arrived at a narrow terrace house in Clerkenwell, not far from a disused brewery. It was a modest but tidy residence, the knocker brass, the curtains drawn. A maid answered, and upon hearing Holmes's name, admitted us at once. Mr. Horace Athelney met us in the study lined with ledgers and dusty volumes of maritime law. He was a portly man in his 50s with a florid complexion and the pinched expression of one unaccustomed to surprise. "Mr. Holmes," he said curtly. "I take it this concerns Evelyn? You've heard? A telegram reached me this morning." He glanced toward the hearth. "It seems rather sudden, though in keeping with his flair for melodrama. You parted ways recently, did you not?" "We did," Athelney replied, tugging at his cuffs. "A disagreement over assets. Sir Evelyn had begun selling off shares of our joint venture to fund his infernal theatre schemes. I told him plainly that I wouldn't stand for it. He dissolved our partnership 3 weeks ago." Holmes moved about the room, trailing his fingers lightly along the spines of books. "Did he threaten you?" "At worst, he insulted my character, but I never wished him harm." "Where were you last night?" "I dined with my sister in Highbury. I left her house at midnight. Several neighbours saw me arrive." Holmes nodded, apparently satisfied. "One final question, Mr. Athelney. Do you know if Sir Evelyn had received any, shall we say, anonymous correspondence lately? Letters, warnings, or threats?" Athelney blinked. He often did. He relished them. Fanatics, critics, the usual rabble. He used to keep a collection which he read aloud for sport. Holmes's lips curved faintly. "Thank you, Mr. Athelney. That may prove most useful." Back in the cab, Holmes was unusually quiet. I ventured a question. "Well, is Athelney our man?" "No," Holmes said with certainty. "He has no flair for subtlety. This crime required precision, intimacy, and silence. Athelney is more likely to hurl a decanter than drop cyanide in a glass." "Then why question him?" "Because, Watson, we do not search for guilt alone. We search for fear. And Mr. Athelney, I think, is afraid of something." The cab turned south and crossed the Thames, the fog thickening again, until the world was a grey veil. At length Holmes asked the driver to let us off in Lambeth, near a row of abandoned warehouses. I was confused. "Holmes, what now?" "I told you there was a shadow. Every well-planned crime has a footprint, however faint. In this case, it came not through the front door, but the servant's entrance, and only someone known to the staff could pass unchallenged." "You believe someone entered unseen?" "I do, and I believe someone inside the house aided them. The butler, perhaps, or someone with keys. And what do we hope to find here? An answer, or an accomplice?" Holmes led me down a narrow alley behind the warehouse. There, huddled near a rusted barrel, was a thin figure in a threadbare overcoat. Holmes approached with quiet purpose. "Good evening, Mr. Cribbs." The man looked up sharply. His face was narrow and pinched, his eyes bloodshot. "You again?" "I told you last time, I don't deal in—" "I'm not here for what you sell," Holmes interrupted coolly. "Only what you know. You work deliveries for several Mayfair kitchens, including number 12 Grosvenor Square." "Maybe I do." "You were there yesterday evening?" "You entered through the back, around 9:30. Cribbs said nothing, but his twitching fingers confirmed Holmes's guess. "I'll give you 5 sovereigns to tell me who entered behind you." Cribbs hesitated, then spat. "I never saw his face. He had the coat and boots of a footman, but he weren't no servant. Too stiff, too quiet. Slipped in and disappeared up the back stairs." "Did you see where he went?" "Number, but he was carrying something, a small black case. Holmes's expression sharpened. "Thank you, Mr. Cribbs, that will be all." As we walked back into the mist, I asked, "What do you make of that?" "Exactly what I suspected," Holmes said softly. "A shadow passed through Grosvenor Square that night. Now we know it had form and purpose." He paused, his breath hanging in the air like smoke. "The true game, Watson, has just begun. Chapter 5, The Vanishing Footman." The next morning dawned pallid and cold, the London fog thinning but leaving behind a sullen dampness that clung to the city like a mournful shroud. Holmes and I returned to number 12 Grosvenor Square at 8:30, our boots leaving faint prints on the frost-bitten flagstones. The household was subdued. The guests had been asked to remain until further notice, and though no formal charge had been made, a certain heaviness pervaded the air, like the closing movement of a symphony in a minor key. Inspector Gregson greeted us in the front hall. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he said, a trace of impatience creeping into his voice, "I trust you have not dragged us into the fog on a hunch." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "On the contrary, Inspector, I believe we are close to the truth. But first, a matter of staff." Inspector Gregson greeted us in the front hall. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he said, a trace of impatience creeping into his voice, "I trust you have not dragged us into the fog on a hunch." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "On the contrary, Inspector, I believe we are close to the truth. But first, a matter of staff." "Staff?" "Yes, the household servants. I require the names of all who were employed here last night, particularly those with access to the dining room and cellar." Gregson produced a small notepad. "There are 5. The butler, Graves, the housekeeper, Mrs. Turner, a parlour maid named Elsie, a kitchen boy, and 1 footman, Charles Dunning." Holmes took the list, scanning it quickly. "And where is this Dunning now?" "That's the curious part," said Gregson. "He's missing." Holmes's expression did not change, but his eyes glittered. "Missing? Hasn't been seen since the early hours of the morning. His room was found empty, his uniform still hanging in the wardrobe. We've questioned the rest of the staff. They say he was quiet, kept to himself. No family, no close ties. Came on recommendation from a West End agency 3 months ago." "Have you sent a man to the agency?" "I've dispatched a constable, but I've got a bad feeling, Mr. Holmes." Inspector Gregson greeted us in the front hall. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he said, a trace of impatience creeping into his voice, "I trust you have not dragged us into the fog on a hunch." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "On the contrary, Inspector, I believe we are close to the truth. But first, a matter of staff." "Staff?" "Yes, the household servants. I require the names of all who were employed here last night, particularly those with access to the dining room and cellar." Gregson produced a small notepad. "There are 5. The butler, Graves, the housekeeper, Mrs. Turner, a parlour maid named Elsie, a kitchen boy, and 1 footman, Charles Dunning." Holmes took the list, scanning it quickly. "And where is this Dunning now?" "That's the curious part," said Gregson. "He's missing." Holmes's expression did not change, but his eyes glittered. "Missing? Hasn't been seen since the early hours of the morning. His room was found empty, his uniform still hanging in the wardrobe. We've questioned the rest of the staff. They say he was quiet, kept to himself. No family, no close ties. Came on recommendation from a West End agency 3 months ago." "Have you sent a man to the agency?" "I've dispatched a constable, but I've got a bad feeling, Mr. Holmes." I frowned. "Do you think he entered the dining room after the dinner?" "I think he entered it during the blackout. He may have been the shadow Mr. Cribbs saw. The disguise of a servant is convenient, especially if one is not in fact a servant at all. A hired killer? Perhaps, or a participant in a scheme more elaborate than simple murder. Come, we must speak to Graves. We found the butler in the scullery supervising the polishing of silver. He was a tall man, thin as a curtain rod, and wore his years like starch. "Mr. Graves," Holmes said, "when did you last see the footman, Dunning?" Graves did not hesitate. "He was present during the dinner, sir. I instructed him to serve the soup and remove the entree. After that, I sent him to fetch a new bottle of port from the cellar." "And did he return?" "Not to me. I presumed he'd passed it to the parlour maid. I was occupied with the lights, you see." "Who lit the candles?" "I did, sir. I doused the chandelier as Sir Evelyn requested, then relit the sconces after the toast." "And in the darkness, was Dunning accounted for?" Graves blinked. "Now that you mention it, no, sir. I don't recall seeing him." Holmes turned away, deep in thought. As we left the room, he murmured, "The more we search for Dunning, the more I believe he never truly existed. You think he was an imposter?" "Precisely. Perhaps a man planted in this household months ago, waiting for this very moment." "But why the theatre? Why the drama of the toast?" "To mask the crime," Holmes said simply. "To allow the killer to approach with no suspicion. In the dark, every guest was a silhouette. Who would notice one more? We were interrupted by the arrival of Miss Lydia Ashcroft. Her face was pale, and she held something in her hand, a folded scrap of paper. "I found this," she said, voice trembling slightly, "in the drawer of my cousin's writing desk. It's addressed only to L.A. He always used initials." Holmes took it gently, unfolding the paper. His eyes scanned the contents, and his brow furrowed. "Well, Watson," he said at length, "the plot thickens. Sir Evelyn believed he was being watched. This letter is a confession of sorts, a warning, perhaps even a trap." "What does it say?" I asked. Holmes read aloud, "Dearest L.A., if anything should befall me, know that it was not fate, but design. There are vultures in the parlour. I have changed my will. I have hidden something they dearly wished to find. Trust only what is not obvious." Holmes folded the letter carefully. "It appears Sir Evelyn knew the danger he faced. He even left us a clue. Trust only what is not obvious. That, Watson, is the very soul of detective work. And what do you suppose he hid?" "Something worth killing for," Holmes replied. "Perhaps not money, perhaps not even an object, but a truth." He looked out the window toward the fog-bound square, his expression unreadable. "I believe it's time we examined the study closely. I suspect Sir Evelyn has left us more than words, and if we're fortunate, the vanished footman may have overlooked something very small, but very telling." And with that, Holmes swept out of the room, the letter clutched tightly in his hand, and a singular gleam of certainty dawning in his eyes. Chapter 6. The Secret in the Study. The study at number 12 was a sanctum of polished mahogany, leather-bound volumes, and the faint lingering scent of pipe tobacco mingled with old parchment. Holmes stood at the threshold, his keen eyes sweeping over every detail, the arrangement of books, the scrawl of notes on the blotter, the faint imprint of a hand pressed against a dusty window pane. Sir Evelyn was a man of theatrics, Holmes mused, but he was also methodical in his eccentricity. This room, Watson, may yet yield secrets that even the most cursory search would overlook. I followed him inside, noting the faint chill in the air, as though the room still carried the echo of some unseen presence. The fire in the grate was banked but not cold. Someone had been here recently. Holmes moved to the large desk, clearing scattered papers with deliberate care. His fingers paused over a small leather-bound journal, its edges worn. "Notice, Watson," he said, "the lock on this desk drawer is broken, as if it had been forced or manipulated. This tells us someone sought particular papers, perhaps those relating to Sir Evelyn's will. I bent to peer inside the open drawer. It contained a jumble of letters, some bearing the embossed seal of a London solicitor, others typed notices of business transactions, but no will. "Look here," Holmes said, holding up a sheet. "A draft of the new will, handwritten. It differs significantly from the last public version. The beneficiary has changed." "To whom?" I asked. "An unexpected name, Miss Lydia Ashcroft." Lydia's eyes widened when Holmes shared the revelation. "He never told me," she whispered. "Why would he do that?" Holmes was already moving, his gaze falling on a small bookcase in the corner. He pulled a volume titled The Art of Secrecy from the shelf, revealing a hidden compartment behind it. Inside lay a small black velvet case, matching the description given by Mr. Cribbs. Holmes opened the case with a delicate snap. Inside was a diamond cufflink, glinting faintly despite the dim light. "So the missing cufflink has been hidden here all along," Holmes said softly. "Sir Evelyn hid this on his person for years, and yet now it was secreted away, presumably to protect it. Why would the killer remove it?" I asked. "To prevent us from discovering what it symbolizes." Holmes's gaze was intense. "Let me show you something else." He took the cufflink and examined it closely. Around the base was an engraving, tiny and nearly imperceptible without close scrutiny. "New year, new dawn," Holmes read aloud. "It sounds poetic," I said. "But what does it mean?" Holmes smiled faintly. "It means Sir Evelyn's murder was no accident of business, but a signal. The cufflinks are a key to a larger secret, one worth killing for." As Holmes studied the engraving, a sudden knock startled us. The door opened, and Inspector Gregson stepped inside. "I thought you might want to see this," he said, holding a small envelope. Holmes took it, examining the seal and the handwriting with great interest. It was found in the library, hidden beneath the floorboards. Holmes broke the seal and read aloud, "To Mr. Sherlock Holmes, you are closer than you know. The shadows lengthen, but the dawn is near. Beware the man who fades in the mist. He holds the final truth. A friend." I looked at Holmes, whose expression was unreadable. "A threat or a clue?" I asked. Holmes tucked the note into his pocket. "Both, perhaps, but more importantly, it confirms someone else is watching and waiting." He stepped to the window, peering out onto the fog-enshrouded street. "The man who fades in the mist," he murmured. "Could be the vanished footman or the real culprit." He turned, eyes gleaming. "Watson, I believe the time has come to confront our suspects again. The pieces are aligning and the web is tightening. The question remains, who walks unseen, who wears the mask, and who will slip away before the dawn? Chapter 7. The Confrontation. The drawing room at number 12 Grosvenor Square had never seemed so oppressive. The morning's gloom persisted despite the noon hour, and the great windows framed the dull, swirling mist, as if a curtain closed between us and the world beyond. Holmes sat in a high-backed armchair, hands steepled, eyes alight, with a keen anticipation. I stood nearby, observing the gathered guests, Miss Lydia Ashcroft, pale but composed, Mr. Horace Athelney, his florid face unusually drawn, the housekeeper, Mrs. Turner, clutching a handkerchief, the parlour-maid, Elsie, who kept her gaze fixed on the carpet, and, of course, Inspector Gregson, ready with a notepad and sharp eyes. Holmes rose and began speaking with deliberate calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We have now assembled all the pieces necessary to unveil the truth behind the tragic events of New Year's Eve." He paused, glancing around the room, his gaze piercing yet measured. "Sir Evelyn Ashcroft's death was no accident, no sudden collapse from overindulgence, but a carefully orchestrated murder. The question we face is this: Who had the motive, the opportunity, and the cunning to commit such a crime? Holmes turned to the assembled servants first. To begin with, the footman, Charles Dunning, is not who he claimed to be. In fact, Dunning is an alias. The man was hired months ago by an agent of Mr. Athelney to gain access to this household. Athelney's eyes widened in protest. "That is nonsense." Holmes raised a hand. "Allow me to explain. The man you knew as Dunning was in reality an operative, a private investigator of sorts, tasked to uncover if Sir Evelyn was hiding any secret assets. It appears he found more than he bargained for." Mrs. Turner gasped, and Elsie's fingers clenched into fists. Holmes continued. "During the blackout, this man slipped away from his role as footman and entered the dining room carrying a small black case, the one found hidden in the study's secret compartment. It contained the diamond cufflinks, which were Sir Evelyn's signal for a hidden truth. He paused for effect. It was then he was confronted. The real killer, anticipating discovery, seized the opportunity to silence him. Holmes turned to Athelney. "You, Mr. Athelney, had every reason to want your former partner dead. You opposed his changes. You knew of the new will naming Miss Ashcroft. Your telegram and rapid arrival were hardly those of an innocent man." Athelney bristled. "I deny it." "But your fingerprints were found on the broken desk lock," Holmes said quietly, "and you failed to provide an alibi for the crucial hours after dinner." Gregson stepped forward. "We have also traced the source of the candle wax to Athelney's private study. You attempted to tamper with the lighting to cover your actions." Athelney's protest faltered. Holmes's gaze shifted to Miss Ashcroft. Miss Ashcroft, you were unaware of the change in the will, yet Sir Evelyn trusted you enough to confide in that cryptic letter. You are innocent of direct involvement." She nodded slowly, relief apparent in her eyes. Holmes turned finally to the servants. The butler, Graves, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Turner, both deny any knowledge of the footman's true identity. However, Graves's testimony contains inconsistencies, and the timing of candle lighting was altered to conceal the blackout's exact duration. Graves swallowed hard, but said nothing. Holmes faced the room. "Now, the final piece, the missing will itself. It was hidden inside the journal we found, wrapped in a cipher only Sir Evelyn would understand, a cipher based on his theatrical scripts." He smiled faintly. "A touch of drama indeed." Holmes then produced a folded manuscript and read aloud an excerpt that revealed the location of a secret safe concealed behind the fireplace, a place overlooked by all but the most observant. From the safe, Holmes withdrew the original will bearing the signature and the new beneficiary's name. Sir Evelyn sought to ensure his legacy was protected from those who would exploit it. He knew the dangers he faced and thus took precautions that ultimately led to his undoing. Holmes's eyes gleamed as he delivered his final statement. "The killer is Mr. Horace Athelney. He hired the imposter footman to spy, and when the truth threatened to emerge, he struck in the darkness. His rage and greed blinded him to the careful planning of Sir Evelyn and the cunning of those who sought justice." Athelney's face paled, and he suddenly bolted for the door. Gregson caught him swiftly. "You're under arrest for the murder of Sir Evelyn Ashcroft." As the handcuffs clicked shut, Holmes turned to the others. "And so justice is served. But let this be a reminder, Watson. True detection lies not in haste, but in the careful reading of shadows, in seeing what others do not. This, after all, is the art of deduction." Chapter 8. The Unraveling. The room was hushed, but for the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. All eyes were fixed upon Holmes as he stood before the assembled company in the drawing-room. The weight of the moment was palpable. Even Inspector Gregson waited with an almost reverential stillness. Holmes began, his voice calm and precise. Though Mr. Athelney has been apprehended and the apparent motive revealed, the full truth requires a closer examination, one that involves the subtle interplay of human nature, misdirection, and the art of observation. He walked slowly to the fireplace and tapped the hidden safe. The concealment was ingenious but also symbolic. A barrier not merely of wood and metal, but of deceit and ambition, Sir Evelyn's final testament, tucked within layers of cipher and drama, was meant to protect those he loved from the ravenous grasp of his erstwhile partner. Holmes then produced the diamond cufflink once more, holding it up to the light. This cufflink, trivial in appearance, was the master key to the entire mystery. Its inscription, New Year, New Dawn, was a motto known only to a select few, within Sir Evelyn's inner circle. It referred not merely to a fresh calendar, but to a fresh start, a transfer of trust and fortune. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. But consider the footprints, the candle wax, and the shadowy figure glimpsed during the blackout. The man we called Dunning was no simple footman, but an agent of truth, a loyalist to Sir Evelyn's cause. His disappearance was the first attempt to silence that cause. Holmes turned toward the butler, Graves, whose stiff composure finally broke. "Mr. Graves, you assisted Athelney by failing to report the footman's absence and manipulating the lighting to obscure the timeline. You believed your loyalty lay with the master's partner, not with justice." Graves' voice trembled. "I only sought to protect the house, sir." Holmes's expression softened, but his voice remained firm. Protection built on lies is a fragile foundation. Finally, Holmes addressed the room. The true brilliance of Sir Evelyn lay in the letter found by Miss Ashcroft, a riddle meant to guide us to the truth. Trust only what is not obvious is the detective's maxim itself. The theft of the will, the orchestration of the blackout, and the planting of the impostor were meant to mislead. But the smallest details, the wax on the boot, the timing of candle lighting, the cipher in the journal, all betray the killer's hand. He folded his hands. In conclusion, the crime was a marriage of greed and desperation, committed in the darkness but undone by light, the light of logic and observation. Justice, as always, will prevail. A murmur of relief passed through the room as Inspector Gregson nodded firmly. Holmes turned to me, his eyes twinkling with quiet satisfaction. "Watson, this case reaffirms what I have long maintained, that the devil, and indeed the solution, is in the details." I could only agree, humbled once again by his unparalleled mind. As the mist lifted from Grosvenor Square, so too did the veil of mystery that had shrouded that tragic New Year's Eve, and with it, a new dawn of justice had indeed arrived.